what really happened behind those closed doors during Blake Lively's highly anticipated deposition? The truth is starting to come out, and it is not what her team wanted anyone to see in a world where every move, every word, and every legal filing can become a headline. The tension surrounding this case has reached a boiling point. This is not just about Hollywood egos or studio disputes anymore. This has become a battle for credibility, a fight for control, and a war over who gets to shape the truth. From the moment Blake walked into that building on 7th Avenue in New York, flanked by 8 attorneys and her inner circle, the atmosphere was already crackling with intensity. Not just because of what was at stake, but because of who she would be facing inside that room. Across the table sat Justin Baldoni and Jamie Heath, the very people who believed that she orchestrated a campaign of manipulation and destruction that tore through their professional and personal lives. This was no ordinary deposition, and now, thanks to a few legal leaks and unsealed documents, we are starting to understand just how explosive that day really was. Blake Lively has long tried to present herself as a passive participant in a much larger drama, someone dragged into legal chaos by others. But the evidence emerging paints a very different picture. Instead of a bystander, we see someone actively steering the narrative, influencing scenes on set, dictating creative changes, and even attempting to control what others were allowed to say and do. And the most shocking part of all is that many of the most damaging pieces of evidence were submitted not by her opponents, but by her own legal team. Text messages, internal emails, deposition summaries, all pointing to a level of involvement that is impossible to ignore. And while her attorneys scramble to manage the fallout, arguing over whether her own lawyer should be treated as a publicist instead of a legal representative, the court of public opinion is already shifting. Major outlets that once covered her favorably are now starting to question the story she has been telling, and the public is watching every move, dissecting every document, and calling out every contradiction. And as this legal firestorm intensifies, the question is no longer whether Blake Lively will be vindicated or condemned. It is how much damage has already been done, and whether her team has any strategy left that can contain it. Because this case is no longer just about a lawsuit, it is about power, perception, and the high cost of trying to control a narrative when the receipts are already out there and they are telling a very different story. Buckle up, because what happened in that deposition room was just the beginning, and the fallout is only getting started. Let's begin with what actually went down inside the deposition room, because despite how private these meetings are supposed to be, there has been a surprising leak that gives us a glimpse into what might have been one of the most stressful moments for Blake Lively. The setting itself was already tense. The location chosen was the law office of her own legal team, in a high-rise on 7th Avenue in New York City, a privilege not many get, but she did, likely due to her high-profile status. Now, what makes this situation even more intense is the fact that she did not walk in alone. She was accompanied by 8 attorneys, yes, 8, not 3, not 4, but a full legal army, along with her sister, her best friend, and her husband, Ryan Reynolds. Although they remained outside the deposition room, once inside, Blake had to face Justin Baldoni and his business partner Jamie Heath. Throughout the entire proceeding, the atmosphere must have been thick with tension. Every look, every pause, every document handed across the table carried a weight beyond ordinary legal matters. It was not just about answering questions, but about holding composure in front of people who believe you are responsible for massive damage to their lives and reputations. And yes, we now know some fragments of what occurred in that room. One of the filings made later refers to something Blake herself admitted under oath. According to this document, Blake acknowledged that the only campaign she is personally aware of is the one that started after Justin Baldoni filed his defense and counterclaims. In her words, that was the real smear campaign. In her view, Baldoni defending himself and providing evidence against her claims constitutes a retaliatory act. In other words, by proving that her statements were not accurate, Baldoni was allegedly attacking her. And it gets more intricate. Her legal team has tried to discredit Baldoni's attorney, Brian Friedman, by arguing that Friedman should not be treated like an attorney in this case, but rather a PR agent. Because of his media appearances, they claim he crossed a line by giving interviews to outlets like TMZ, Megyn Kelly, and Billy Bush. However, what they fail to mention is that their own lawyer, Michael Gottlieb, appeared on CNN for a segment relating to the case. This attempt to strip away attorney-client privilege is not just aggressive, it is unprecedented, and it raises questions about the strategy at play. Are they trying to build a case, or just distract from the weaknesses in their own? When Blake Lively's team submitted a series of text messages to support their motion to subpoena Rob Sullivan, the editor of the film It Ends With Us, they might have made a serious miscalculation. These texts were meant to justify why it was so urgent to reach him, but in doing so, they exposed internal conversations that paint a very different picture of Blake Lively's role in the Film One message from Henny Grace reveals that Blake had final approval over certain scenes, even those not involving her directly. This includes scenes with the younger version of her character. The implication is that she used her influence to reshape the project to align with her personal preferences. Another team member questioned why she had authority over scenes she was not involved in, to which the response was that she felt unsafe during the original writing process and demanded revised contracts to expand her control over the film. That level of oversight is not common, especially for someone who is not directing or producing the film. And her legal team voluntarily submitted these messages thinking they were helpful to their case. Instead, they are being used to illustrate how deeply involved she was in controlling the creative direction, and that undermines the idea that she was merely acting as talent, not as someone in charge of production power. When Baldoni's team saw this, they simply asked that the phone numbers be redacted, but allowed the content to be part of the court record. That decision alone says a lot. It means they viewed these texts as beneficial to their side because they show a pattern of behavior that contradicts the narrative Blake Lively has been pushing. And the press is finally taking note. Business Insider, a platform that was previously seen as leaning sympathetic to her side, ran a story detailing how the film editor Rob Sullivan expressed frustration over Lively's influence in editing, especially in scenes involving younger actors and flashbacks. This marks a shift in public reporting, where even major outlets are beginning to question her version of events. We also need to talk about the desperate efforts to reach Rob Sullivan, because this has turned into a spectacle on its own. According to new legal documents, Blake Lively's team tried multiple times to serve him with a subpoena. They even observed that his lights and television were on, but he refused to open the door. The judge ultimately allowed them to post the subpoena on his door. This behavior might appear evasive, but it also reflects the increasing aggressiveness of Blake's legal strategy, a strategy that seems to be backfiring in some ways, because alongside this we now have confirmation that Blake Lively withdrew her subpoenas to 5 content creators previously targeted for their coverage of the lawsuit. These included several people who have been outspoken about her role in the controversy. The justification for these subpoenas was always questionable, and now with their withdrawal, it sends a message that perhaps those moves were more about intimidation than legitimate legal pursuit. This is further underscored by the fact that Blake's legal team is also attempting to access all communications from Brian Friedman, including emails and calls with journalists and creators, arguing that because Friedman appeared on media platforms, he should not be shielded by traditional legal confidentiality. This tactic is raising eyebrows across legal circles because it blurs the lines between legal advocacy and public relations and may ultimately harm their own case. Even more interesting is the text chain voluntarily submitted by Blake's team, where internal conversations showed multiple collaborators raising concerns about her level of creative control. One producer commented that Blake used safety concerns to justify renegotiating contracts, giving her power over scenes she was never intended to have control over. Another member simply said, shaking my head in response to her demands, revealing frustration and disbelief from her colleagues. This is not how a typical actor behaves on set. This is the behavior of someone determined to steer the project, and that undermines the argument that she was a passive participant simply doing her job. If anything, it supports Baldoni's claim that she tried to hijack the project and steer it in a direction that suited her own agenda. And the question is, why did her legal team submit these messages? What were they trying to prove? Did they believe that showing her taking charge would make her look professional and involved? Because that is not how the messages come across to anyone who reads them. They appear to reinforce the idea that Blake was not simply acting in a film, she was controlling it. And now we come to the part about what Blake Lively allegedly said in her deposition, as revealed through filings linked to the motion to quash the subpoena against Friedman's office. According to the document, Blake stated under oath that the only ongoing smear campaign she is aware of is the one created by Baldoni and his team when they filed counterclaims and started defending themselves. And she described those actions as retaliatory, meaning, in her view, simply disproving her allegations is a form of attack. This is a dangerous narrative because it tries to recast a legal defense as harassment, and that is not how the justice system works. If you sue someone, you have to expect that they will respond, and if they prove you wrong, that is not a smear campaign, that is due process. The fact that she said this under oath is deeply revealing. It shows how far she is willing to stretch definitions to support her story. It also brings us to another major point. Justin Baldoni is now suing his insurance company over its refusal to cover his legal expenses. They claimed the triggering event occurred before the policy was active. Baldoni argues that no such triggering event took place. and therefore coverage should be in place. This may sound like a side issue, but it could have major consequences. Legal experts point out that if Baldoni loses the case, he could be stuck with enormous legal bills, but there is one wild card in all. This billionaire investor Steve Sarowitz, who reportedly promised to support Baldoni financially, and allegedly even said he would spend $100 million to take down Blake Lively. Whether or not that is true, Baldoni appears to have strong financial backing, and that changes the dynamics of the case significantly because it means he can afford to fight back with equal force and not be intimidated by the high-profile legal team. On the other side, and on top of all of this, we now have new indications that the public sentiment around this case may be shifting noticeably. Some users have pointed out that comment sections on certain industry news outlets appear to be flooded with pro-Blake comments, many of which seem artificially generated, with copy-paste language or repetitive phrasing suggesting the presence of bots attempting to sway public opinion in her favor. While this is not yet confirmed, it adds to the overall perception that Blake Lively and her team are pulling every possible lever, legal and otherwise, to maintain control of the narrative. But with every misstep, every revealing document, and every legal reversal, that control seems to be slipping further and further away. And now let's turn to the bigger picture, because this case is no longer just about a legal dispute between Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. It has become a symbol of what happens when power, privilege, and control meet public scrutiny, and the cracks are now fully visible. The entire atmosphere surrounding the deposition and what followed has exposed several contradictions in Blake Lively's narrative, starting with her portrayal as someone blindsided by controversy when the evidence paints her as deeply involved in the creative and legal maneuvering from the beginning. And while it is her legal right to be proactive and involved, it is also fair to question why her team continues to submit filings that seem to do more harm than good. From the deposition room to the leaked text messages, we now have a clearer picture of what actually went on behind the scenes of the movie production and what followed in the courtroom. The documents filed by her own team reveal that she was not just an actress performing a role. She was calling shots, influencing edits, demanding changes, and at times, according to her own colleagues, overriding the creative direction of the team. And this is critical because it counters one of the key arguments her legal team has been pushing, that she was not in a position of power and therefore should not be held responsible for the broader decisions surrounding the film and its direction. But how can that claim hold weight when her name is seen approving or denying specific scenes, especially ones not even featuring her directly? And while some may argue this is just standard celebrity involvement, others are now saying this level of control crosses the line, especially when it impacts others in the production, including younger actors and editors who are trying to do their job. And now that the text messages are public, these same individuals are being dragged into a court case they never agreed to be part of. And even more ironic is that the texts show them expressing confusion and discomfort with the control Blake exercised, making it clear that they too were unsure of why she had such sweeping authority. And yet it was her legal team that gave those texts to the court voluntarily, which raises the question again, are these really strategic moves or are these miscalculations? And this brings us to one of the most shocking claims made in the filings tied to her deposition, where she states that the real smear campaign began when Justin Baldoni filed his legal defenses and counterclaims, meaning in her view, the legal response by Baldoni was an attack, not a defense. This idea that presenting evidence and pushing back against false claims is somehow retaliation is not just questionable, it is dangerous, because it suggests that anyone defending themselves in court could be labeled as an aggressor, and it frames accountability as harassment, a notion that undermines the very purpose of legal defense and public truth. And if that framing is accepted, it could have far-reaching implications beyond this case, because it would mean anyone accused of misconduct would be discouraged from speaking up, defending themselves, or setting the record straight, and it would give enormous power to whoever controls the initial narrative. And this is what makes the leak of these details so important, because they reveal not just what happened in that room, but the mindset of those trying to spin it afterwards. And as the public and the press begin to absorb these facts, there is a noticeable shift in coverage. More media outlets are moving away from blind support and starting to ask questions about Blake Lively's involvement in the film and her legal tactics. Beyond Business Insider, several other outlets have begun referencing the court documents and the text messages, drawing attention to the contradictions in her story. And this is a huge change from how things looked just a few weeks ago, when many in the media seemed hesitant to question her version of events. And the irony is that the turning point was not an investigation by journalists or a leaked memo from the other side. It was a legal filing submitted by her own team, and the ripple effect of that continues as observers and legal experts now dissect what it means for the overall case. And if we zoom out further, there is also the matter of content creators and independent journalists, many of whom were subpoenaed by Blake Lively's team earlier in the case, a move that many saw as an attempt to silence dissent, or at the very least gather information on those who were critical of her actions. And while those subpoenas were ultimately withdrawn in several cases, the message they sent was clear: Blake and her legal advisors were willing to use whatever tools they had to control the narrative. And it did not sit well with the online community, especially those who had simply reported publicly available facts or analyzed legal filings which are part of the public record. And now with the withdrawal of those subpoenas, it feels like a retreat, a recognition that those moves were not just legally weak, but also damaging from a public relations perspective. And this is the part of the case that goes beyond the courtroom, because it touches on questions of fairness, access to information, and freedom of commentary when powerful individuals or teams try to use the legal system to intimidate critics or suppress reporting. It sets a precedent that threatens transparency and accountability. And as we now know, the backlash to those tactics has been loud and sustained, not just from journalists, but from legal analysts, tech experts, and even former public relations professionals who have all said that this case is now becoming a lesson in how not to handle crisis management and reputation control. And as this continues, more leaks, more documents, and more interviews are expected. And with each new development, it becomes harder for Blake Lively's team to regain control of the story, because it is no longer just about what she says happened. It is about what her team has already shown in black and white text messages, emails, legal filings, and deposition transcripts that contradict much of what has been presented in public. As we step back and look at the complete picture unfolding from this legal drama, one thing becomes clear: the carefully crafted image that Blake Lively and her legal team have tried to maintain is beginning to unravel, not because of rumors, not because of conspiracy theories, but because of the very evidence presented in court filings, documents, and voluntary submissions that now raise more questions than they answer. From her unusually large legal entourage to the strategic choices made around the location of her deposition, everything has pointed to a need for control, a desire to shape not just the narrative, but the environment around it. And yet that control has slipped through the cracks each time her own team has attempted to push back against claims made by Justin Baldoni and his representation. They have inadvertently handed over ammunition that paints her in a less than flattering light. The internal text messages, the creative overreach on set, the admission under oath that defending oneself in court is somehow a smear campaign, all of it has exposed the contradictions within her legal narrative. And if the goal was to prove that she was never truly in control, that she was simply caught up in a whirlwind of events, the mounting evidence is now telling a different story, a story of someone deeply embedded in the decision-making, someone whose colleagues openly questioned her authority, and someone who now finds herself struggling to explain why all of this points back to her. Even the attempt to subpoena content creators and journalists only served to spotlight the lengths her team was willing to go to keep control over the story being told online and in the media. And yet the result has been the opposite. Instead of silencing critics, it emboldened them. Instead of deflecting scrutiny, it attracted more of it. Instead of protecting her reputation, it called it into question more severely than ever before. And with major outlets now picking up on these developments, the reach of this story is only growing. Every piece of paper filed, every interview given, every quote leaked is building a timeline that is becoming increasingly hard to challenge or revise. And that is the real cost of this entire saga, because beyond the court dates and legal strategies lies a fundamental truth. Once the narrative escapes your grasp, it is almost impossible to reclaim it. And that is exactly where Blake Lively finds herself now, surrounded by filings that do more harm than good press coverage, that is no longer automatically sympathetic, and a legal opponent who appears more organized, more transparent, and more consistent with each passing week. The road ahead for her will not be easy. The questions will continue, the evidence will keep surfacing, and the public will not forget what they have already seen, because this is not just a case anymore. It is a reckoning, one that will echo far beyond the courtroom and into every corner of an industry that is finally learning that control and truth are not always the same thing.